Good afternoon, BookTube. Well, we're back. It has been a very long time. I had such plans to try to launch this YouTube last year, and yet the reasons for the lapse will have to wait for another episode. I will give a short summary right now, really just one word: world grief. And it does tie in a little bit to what I want to do today, but the full explanation will come later. We've just been living through a very difficult decade, and the polycrisis that we face leads to a lot of questions about how best to make use of the time we have, the resources we have, what platforms, what kind of work should we be pouring ourselves into at this juncture. Now, I do have a lot of hope for speculative fiction. I always have. But last year, there was definitely a moment where I lost a lot of confidence in the maturity of our industries to be able to reflect the best of what speculative fiction can do for a world in the middle of so many problems. And I say that with no judgment for individuals, because the reason I think a lot of us weren't able to really rise to the challenges of the age appropriately is because we are all we're trapped in the age, and we are trying our best to survive individually, to make it individually. So if we fall into very small scale commercial forms of activism that focus more on our own ability to make a living, that's to be expected. It's just a little frustrating when the field of speculative fiction doesn't seem to have much more capacity to reflect thoughtfully on the circumstances we're moving through, and to try to carry us forward by building better narratives, better ways of thinking about the world, ways of thinking that could mobilize us a little bit better. But we'll go into all of that another time. World grief is the short answer. And yet, that world grief did bring me full circle back to speculative fiction in the end. And launching this YouTube channel anew is about uplift, trying to lean into what I think works best. We're going to start with my happy place. We're going to start with Clarkesworld this week. We're going to do a magazine review. As you can see, if you have visual capabilities, there is the cover of the most recent Clarkesworld, and that's issue 2010. We're going to talk a little bit about the stories and the nonfiction and the art in the issue. And the reason that I want to start with this one is, well, twofold. First, I strongly feel that Clarkesworld has always been a publication trying to find better ways to grow with the world's needs. And you can certainly see that in some gentle but perhaps also subtle ways, because Neil Clark has always focused on the back end. He's focused on making it so that the editorial team, the slush readers, have the capacity to look a little bit more inclusively into the slush pile, and the financing, focusing on making sure that the financing is present for a growth into more translation. In the time that Clarkesworld has grown as the preeminent publication for international science fiction, we have seen a transformation in how translators are valued and paid, but it came about in large part because of the work of Neil Clark to create a standard, to improve payment, and to improve expectations at a time when many publications would avoid work in translation simply because the costs were too high. So there are many ways to go about inclusivity and equity and activism, and some of them involve definitely fixating on the demographics of specific writers in a way that can sometimes pigeonhole them and create a lot of pressure. When you have a publication with a themed issue that's going to focus on X region, there are huge questions. Who's deciding what work is most representative of that region? how does one have to pitch their work and frame what they're writing about in order to be seen as a worthy author for that kind of issue? It creates a lot of anxiety. But if you create a publication that just has a lot more back-end openness to many different forms of writing and stories, and you work on making sure the financing is there for it, then every writer just gets to be a set of n equals 1, and they can just represent their view of the world. And it will obviously come with rich geopolitics, but without as much pressure to represent the whole of any given region or demographic. So for me, I prefer this approach, and I have loved seeing this publication's commitment to bringing new voices to the table, instead of focusing on soliciting pieces from certain people who might bring a kind of brand recognition to the magazine. Everyone comes up through slush. And even though sometimes people will look at a cover and think, yes, the names must mean something, the order of the names must mean something. No, again, there's really no hierarchy here. It's all good work. They're all good pieces, and they deserve to be celebrated. So that's the first reason, in terms of really just enjoying the publication and appreciating the aesthetics and approach to growing with the world. The second reason is because Clarkesworld became very much an embodiment of certain cultural problems in the last year, but not in the most effective way, because so many of us are locked into certain understandings of the world that we really don't necessarily see the biggest problems, or maybe see that we have agency to do something about the biggest problems. So Clarkesworld gained a lot more fame last year, precisely because it was hit hard by a tremendous number of so-called AI scam publications. And so it became quite a sensation for a few news cycles where everyone was talking about how this was the beginning of the end. Now, the scam publications weren't too different from something that had already been going on for a while. It's just the quantity is just much harder to deal with the vast number of scams that can now be submitted, but the underlying cultures that lead to those kinds of scam submissions have not changed. You have Clarkesworld with a high, for the industry, high payment for writers and an international mandate. It's definitely going to read to a lot of people from parts of the world where the equivalent of a story sale is pretty much a year's salary. Of course you're going to get people trying to find a way to get published by this magazine. It has nothing to do with wanting to be part of the SFF world. It's about wanting to live. So the bigger geopolitics tend to be forgotten because everyone was so panicked about AI, these so-called artificial intelligences, which are really just large language models. And yes, there are some problems that need to be dealt with on the back end for that. But the real problem, is that everyone latched on to the quote-unquote AI aspect. Oh my goodness, it's going to ruin these magazines. They're going to have to shutter because of AI before I get to get published and become famous, etc. Meanwhile, Neil Clark for years has been pointing out that the industry has not been well funded, that short fiction venues have not been well supported, that everyone wants to be able to access free material, and they also want a high fee for the writers, but the investment in the publications isn't matching those high expectations. And so long before our current trend cycle, we were already having a problem with translating readers into paying readers. And then the real artificial intelligence of note, corporate monopoly, continued to cause greater problems for a wide number of publications by taking away their ability to manage their own subscription lists and to have as much control or autonomy over pricing. So Amazon is our AI of note, but it's not as exciting and it's not as good at moving copy as talking about the hype around AI. That hype around AI serves, again, more corporations, quite honestly, because right now with crypto having failed so spectacularly and NFTs as well having had their trend cycle, the huge push right now in investment income is trying to get people to buy into either AI development or protection against AI development. And we are in the middle of a huge economic panic and hype cycle again. At the same time that there are much more serious underlying threats for our industry with respect to corporations that simply want to scrape as much value as they can from the hard work of many creators. And so Neil Clark has been trying to let people know about this, and recently he had to let people know because Clarkesworld is now seeing some huge problems in terms of financing because of that lost autonomy under the Amazon model. And he's not the only one. It's not the only publication. But unless we can be more mature about our problems and recognize that we're not going to get threats from quote-unquote Skynet so much as the parent corporation that owns Skynet, until we can live up to often what we talk about in our writing and actually look at the big systemic issues, we are going to be frantically moving from one very poor substitute to another in the middle of a publishing world where there are more people than ever really hoping that they might be able to make some kind of a living or a mark with their creative product. So it's a tough time. And the best thing to do about it right now is subscribe. Subscribe to Clarkesworld, subscribe to its Patreon, and if there are other publications that you admire and support, please support those too. Right now, what we really need is a shift away from corporate monopoly. We need to find other ways of platforming and supporting the growth of this work, and to continue to support people who have been curating tremendous changes in the industry for the last while. So with that in mind, I just want to share some of the work from this issue. I used to do this with Twitter threads. When I did it with Twitter threads, I just did a capsule review. I didn't focus on saying which pieces were the best or not. But today I'm gonna emphasize that there are a couple pieces I really, really enjoyed. But we will talk across the board. And I did look up all the names before just to get pronunciation, but I might still make a mistake as I go. So hopefully not too difficult to find the names of the authors no matter what. I want to start with the cover art. Not all of you will be able to see that for anyone listening in without visual. It is very much emblematic of this publication. Clarkesworld captures a sense of wonder and awe with the art that it chooses. This one is by Marco Zagara, and it is called Ancestor. It has a space background. You can tell they're floating in space, and there's this backdrop of some kind of massive technological structure, maybe an opening to a larger facility. But the key is that in the midground you have these two figures, and they're both astronauts. They're both connected with wires. One astronaut just happens to be a giant compared to the other, and they are moving toward one another, a little bit like the classic shot of depiction of God and Adam just about to touch. But in this case, we have this massive astronaut larger than life and this very tiny one as well. Although maybe the massive one is the real size and the other one just happens to be very small. But a lot of Clarkesworld's art has this feeling attached to it. This play with proportion, this play with size and scope, scale. The elements are just a little bit estranged from what is perhaps more quotidian for us right now. But the pieces that really do play with the sense of scale highlight something that in another century was called the sublime. And the sublime is a sentiment of dualities. It has a sense of wonder and awe and also dread and fear, because we look at the cosmos and it is so much bigger than us, and full of so many things we'll never fully understand. And there is wonder and excitement in that, and there's also a sense of just being crushed, humbled, and terrified by the great beyond. And that's a really good underlying feeling, sentiment to associate with science fiction. That's what hopefully some of the best work that we do can elicit in our readers, is that sense of a scale beyond the everyday, for better and for worse, for wonder and for dread. So some of these pieces here are quite lovely and gentle, and other ones have a lot of heaviness to them. There's always a good range. What I also really love about these issues is that I will always come across somebody new pretty much all the time. There might be one exception every now and then in an issue, but the celebration of new voices is fantastic because it means I go in not knowing what to expect, and the richness and variation of stories really does commend itself well to the publication as a whole. So we're just going to, right now we have 8 pieces in this issue, and I'm just going to talk fairly briefly about each of them. The first one that we have listed is by Fiona Jones. It's called Hello, 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 with exclamation points in the title, and it is a classic theme done beautifully. It has an alien first contact from the point of view of the alien, and this can be so difficult to get right. The urge for a lot of writers is to still anthropomorphize a lot of alien creatures, but Fiona Jones has a really lovely voice for the alien in this piece, as they are trying to understand a being that lives in a context very different than its own, and which it slowly comes to realize might need help in a different way than it originally thought. And so it is a lovely, generous, warm piece that's filled with that sense, obviously, of fear and dread from the other side. You can tell through the narration that the human on the other side is probably absolutely terrified at many points, but we are seeing that terror and that dread and that confusion through a being with a sense of wonder and play first. And so these lovely reversals are so important. One of the benefits of science fiction, when done well, is that it can really allow us to see outside of our subject position and remind us that there are many ways of being in the world. And at a time like this, again, I don't want to get too much into it this time, we'll talk about world grief in another episode. Stories like these are empathy builders. And so this is a really wonderful, generous piece, and I highly recommend it, even if you're not somebody who usually enjoys reading speculative fiction. Next on the list, we have there are some authors that I will see consistently, and as a result, you get to build up a little bit of a sense of expectation with them. So this piece by D.A. Xiaolin Spires is called 9 Beauties in the Entangled Threads. And my feeling, I don't want to impose anything on this author, but when I see a work by Spires, I expect that it is going to deal with an element. You know, it might be a story about fire, it might be a story about wood, it might be a story about certain kinds of minerals or glass or coffee, I think, at one point. And so this one is trees. It's more than trees. There's a bit of an ecosystem component. But this is an author that really much focuses on exploring one medium, I think, in many different pieces. And I don't know if that was intentional. Sometimes authors don't realize fully if they have a particular range or preference until it's pointed out. It might just be that Spires writes these kinds of stories for other reasons, but I know that when I read these pieces, they're going to be reflecting on a medium and building a story around that medium. And so that very much is consistent with Spires' work. This isn't, there are other pieces by Spires that I think I found a little bit more engaging in certain ways, but the piece is a richly inhabited world, and that is certainly something that I always get from Spires' writing. So 9 Beauties in the Entangled Threads is that one. The next one is by Ghan, and it is translated by Andy Dudak. It's called One Flew Over the Songhua River, and this one is a really wonderfully generous piece in a way we don't often see in in science fiction in the Western context, because there's often so much of a fixation on technology being our saving grace. Technology is what's going to move us forward as a species. Discovery is what's going to move us forward as a species. And there is absolutely a science fictional element in this piece, but it focuses on the human loss, the lives that are maybe not shattered, that sounds a little bit dramatic, the lives that are changed, the loves that are lost, the grief that comes from being in the periphery of somebody who has this grand ambition for themselves. And it's not anti-technology, it's not anti-discovery, it's just a piece that sits with the fact that technology and discovery are ostensibly part of a larger human condition. And unless we remember that full human condition while we are in the process of honoring our drives for technology, new discovery, we'll be missing something, we'll be losing something important about ourselves along the way. So a really lovely piece about the adjacent lives around scientific discovery. And beautifully translated. Andy Dudak does translations for Clarkesworld on a few occasions, and I've always quite enjoyed the work that they do. So look for both of them for sure. Okay, the next one is by Malena, Salazar, Maciá, and it's called Geminoid. And Geminoid is, again, a lot. You know, the funny thing is that a lot of stories in Clarkesworld will orient themselves around the same general themes in terms of sometimes clones or artificial intelligence, or in this case something a little bit between the two, not quite a cyborg, not quite a clone, not quite any of those. But what's fascinating is that after all this time, after reading so many different stories about companion beings, no two of them are alike, because the authors always bring very different approaches to the concept of having an alt-human in the presence of a regular human. So this has a story arc aligned with a very familiar idea about cloning body parts and cloning people to help us with medical needs. And it might strain a little bit of suspension of disbelief with respect to the play and the things that the Geminoid, the unit, is allowed to do with the sick child. But the underlying exploration, that sense of what makes us different from the things that we fear might replace us or the things that we use to try to support us, that question is really important. And so there is food for thought in this piece, for sure. And that's a really nice one. Okay, so we've got maybe not the strongest portrayal of this ever, but certainly one that has an approach that is still standing on its own and presenting some interesting ways to reflect on the topic. Okay, next one we have, again, some of these themes, science fiction will sometimes repeat themes over and over, but they can nonetheless be filled with such richness through personal perspective, and that's what you get from Berman Ghan's Phosphorescence. Now, this is a piece that's told in a few different ways, and it blends the human with the scientific, the grand sweeping scope. It's a story that spans a bit of time. It is imagining a few decades out that we humans will come together and have a really important series of conferences to decide on overarching directions for how to save our species. And of course, the three major approaches will not at all be in harmony with one another, and they will be very much at odds in some ways with one another. And through the tension between them will come the question of what is it that we're even trying to save. Now, as I mentioned, I don't mean like I'm never trying to get critical for the authors. It's just that as a writer, sometimes you read this as both a writer and as a general reader. So the same way that some little things about Geminoid or Nine Beauties might not have stood out as much as other components, I did have this really cute, quaint moment. It's like, are we still going to have conferences deciding these things in a few decades' time? Perhaps, we will see. But there is so much humanity in the story, blending this question of who we are, what it is we're trying to save, with the ongoing work on an individual level of continuing to create meaning individually and with the people we love. So these stories offer distinct lenses, and they offer sites for exploration and thought about really important aspects of who we are. That's the work of science fiction at its best. The next one, Alaya Dawn Johnson, has a brief oral history of the Zopilote dock. You'd think that someone who lives in Colombia would have no problem saying that right off the top of their head. A brief oral history of the Zopilote dock. And, oh, no, I'm saying it two different ways. Zopilote dock. That's why I'm just not reading it properly. It's the name of an animal, and it's being used here to reflect oh goodness, I am a little bit tired. I have actually tried to do this many, many times today. But a brief oral history of the Zopilote dock is a story in our near future which imagines just a little bit beyond the current problems that we have with Texas and the many parts of the United States as well, and the horrific repetition of history that comes with many of the laws that are now being enacted in places. Even though it's set in Texas, there are some things that reminded me of recent legislation in Arizona. Just horrific time right now for human rights in many parts of the world. And so this one imagines a future in which a new kind of underground railroad is going to be required in order to create new havens, new support for human beings. And this piece is a lot more pointed on the contemporary history causing problems than a lot that I usually read in Clarkesworld. But at the same time, I think it's utterly important to draw those lines and to be very firm about those connections. We have so many different real-world crises that have been quote-unquote anticipated in science fiction. I want to be careful about how I say this because it makes it sound like the science fiction is being prescient, when really what science fiction is doing is it is all talking about the present moment. So a story like this one, when it's talking about Zopilote dock, this new point of flight and escape and attempt to build a better future, it's not necessarily really about the future a few decades out. It is about the fact that right now we are already seeing people in flight and in terror and struggling and abused and caught up in new systems of oppression, or maybe old systems of oppression and new names. So it is a richly told story, strong characterization, but I do also want to highlight with the story that science fiction, as much as we want to think we are dreaming beyond ourselves, is always going to be about ourselves. And this is definitely a good emblem of that. Okay. But on the other hand, oh yes. So the other thing I like about Clarkesworld is I do often find a lot of mirroring in many of the stories. I do find a lot of beautiful contrasts and juxtapositions, and that comes down to the curation of each issue. So we did have the story, actually a couple stories that are dealing with futures for human beings in space. And then we have Z.K. Abraham's Her Body, the Ship. And this story, a little bit like Hello, 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 imagines a different subject position. And what it does so well is it allows you to empathize with, or at least sympathize with, a protagonist whose decision in the course of this piece, if you were to step back from the story, you would see as perhaps a terrible and dangerous and reckless and selfish choice. And yet the point of the story is not to say necessarily that her choice is the correct one. It's to say that a human being who's been on a generation ship like this for quite some time, who has seen around her all of these different people clinging to a lot of old traditions because they're so looking forward to being able to set down on a new planet and continue exactly those old traditions, those old divides, those old tribalisms all over again in this new space. The subject position of someone who might not agree with that approach after living on this ship her whole life is human, and it matters. And so again, science fiction can estrange us from ourselves and estrange us from our subject positions and allow us to see completely different perspectives. And so even if you come out of the story thinking, oh, that was not necessarily the most democratic of choices that this person has made, it is so well written that you will understand why this person chose the direction they did at cost to everyone else's hopes and dreams as well. So that's like really strongly written piece, and a new to me author, so that's wonderful as well. Okay, and so then the last one in terms of fiction we have by F.E. Choe, and that's Swarm X1048, Ethological Field Report, Canis Lupus Familiaris 6. So again, lots of echoes in this piece because it is from a subject position that is non-human. If I had to imagine, it seems a little bit to be, the species that is observing what's happening seems to be a little bit more on the side of bees from some of the stories, but I don't want to impose too much. It's just there are some hints in the vocabulary. But the point is, this non-human entity is doing field research on our very much destroyed ecosystem, and it is monitoring a lot of the last gasps of life on our planet. And in the middle of that, it kind of falls in love with one Canis lupus familiaris, one little pup in particular. And so this is a loving homage to that one little creature that is living in a toxic landscape where there are humans somewhere trying very hard to fight back against some of the toxicity of their own creation and that they carry with them into these environments, while this other entity is trying its best to document with love and care what's happening on the planet. So just some beautiful echoes across the board. So as you can see, I did have preferences as I read, and I am a little bit tired as I say this, so I hope that it was more or less clear. But there's a good balance between all of these stories in terms of far-flung futures as well as some very unnervingly near presents, but also a lot of subject positions in this piece. In fact, I'd say the vast majority of these pieces use slightly different subject positions than we might be used to in order to deepen our sense of what it means to not only be human, but to try to survive in the ecosystems to which we belong. So really lovely, curated piece overall. The nonfiction is also definitely one of the strengths of Clarkesworld as well. So there's always a really great essay on some science fiction adjacent topic. In this case, Samantha Hind has In a Better Place, Virtual Reality Farming and Science Fiction, and it is a lovely, if a little bit grim, overview of the ways that we have tried to reduce quote-unquote cruelty through technologies that are supposed to improve the outcomes for the meat that we produce. And sometimes that means creating less sentient life forms, but sometimes that also means trying to modify the habitats through, for instance, for VR of some animal forms in our industries. And this is a beautiful piece because it sets up the wide range of possibilities and leaves us with this major pressing question of what is really necessary to reduce cruelty, what kind of reframing on our side is important before we go ahead trying to make short-term quick fixes with technology. Are there bigger systemic factors that could be addressed instead? So that's lovely. And then we have 2 interviews with Arley Sorg. And Arley Sorg, oh my goodness, I have always loved Arley's interviews because he does sometimes focus on some earlier writers, but the vast majority of his writing is people in mid-career, which means that these interviews are just rich reflections on the mess of being a writer in our genre and how difficult publishing is, how complex and scattered many of our trajectories are. It's just quite grounding. So I've always really enjoyed the humanizing nature of these interviews. And so we have 2. We have one, Cultivating Communities, a conversation with Izzy Wasserstein, and that's a lovely reflection, again, on one of those careers that goes in many different directions, and the The framing here, obviously, every interview is based around sort of a new publication or something that's going to be out. So the one that's out most recently is These Fragile Graces, This Fugitive Heart. It's a novella, but around that, there's a lot of reflection on the process and what it took to get to this point in this author's career and where the interests lie. So it gives you a sense of, I'm going to use a reverse. A lot of times when you have to write grant applications or applications to university or job applications, you are expected to frame your life as if everything you've done to this point has been done precisely to get you to that job interview or to that university or to that grant application. And that's just such a lie. Lives are really messy. And so an interview that allows for life to be messy is quite enriching and I think quite heartening. We don't have enough in our genre that deals with mid-career writers. And so interviews like this are absolutely wonderful. The other one is The Globalized Literary Space, a conversation with Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay. Oh my goodness, I am so tired. I really did practice these before I tried to say them. Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, more or less. Padhyay, there we go, is this beautiful piece that reflects an actual commitment to international science fiction. And when I say that, I mean there is an approach to writing about international science fiction that makes it sound like you're just discovering something. And the fact is, these other communities have existed and they just have different approaches. The approach to speculative fiction that exists, for instance, in Bengali literature, and I apologize too if in the background I live by a highway. I've been trying to do this recording since this morning, and so I'm a little bit exhausted, and now there are a lot of trucks outside, so I hope you don't hear those too much. But that's part of being in the world as well. So my point is, with this conversation, the work that comes out of a Western construct in a very commercial science fiction form of the last century can also block us out from a full understanding of our own history. And the hard fact is that most literature is speculative. It is a rare blip of a moment that we moved into more realist forms. But what we have here in this interview is a reflection on some of those other forms. So we have a reflection on these histories that inform the work that is under consideration right now. The latest anthology is The Inhumans and Other Stories, a selection of Bengali science fiction. And Bangla science fiction has its own rich heritage. It's not as if it's just coming into its own. It may be that it is just now entering into our purview, but speculative fiction has been everywhere. And so it is a huge part of how we write. It's always been a part of how we write. And interviews like this are wonderful because they don't try to present the work as if it is completely without a history. It allows us to really see and prepare ourselves for reading something that has a completely different canonical background, perhaps, but a thriving literary background nonetheless. Okay, sorry about the little bit of frustration there, but there was a whole bunch of traffic in the background, which I can hear and hopefully you can't. My main focus for this whole piece was to highlight the fact that there's a lot of terrific work being done, and it is done painstakingly by a lot of people, curated over many years of careful growth, all of which is under threat right now. And because it's under threat, we have to think very seriously about what kind of short fiction economy we want to support. I don't know if we're really ready for the work that is required to try to change our entire system publishing, but we can begin by trying to support individual publications, things that we love, lean into them, talk about the work. So with Clarkesworld, please consider supporting its Patreon, please consider supporting it by subscribing to it, but also in general advocating more and saying it's not acceptable with the corporate monopolies that currently have this vice-like grip on creative pathways. Cannot stand if we really do want to continue to grow work in ways that will allow us to see how rich the full international community of science fiction always has been. Okay, and I think I'll leave it at that before I get too much crank here at what's going on outside. But thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoyed some of this, and I do hope that you follow the link in the connected info box to read some of these stories yourself. Cheers, and until next time.